Hey, I'm Bernie Borges, Chief Customer Officer at Vengresso, and I'm excited to talk to you about a topic that we call account-based podcasting. It's a great lead generation strategy. So, ready? Here we go. So, this session is focused on how to use a podcast to do lead generation, and we call this the account-based podcasting strategy, ABP for short. And if you've heard of or you're already practicing account-based marketing, it actually is the kind of kissing cousin to that. So I want to walk you through this program. This is a program or strategy we've been using for a couple of years now, and it works. So quick introduction. I'm Bernie Borges. As I mentioned, I'm the Chief Customer Officer at Vengresso. I'm also the host of the Modern Marketing Engine podcast. And as such, this is a strategy that we've deployed now for a couple of years. So I want to cover with you a few topics that really explain how this ABP strategy works. I want to talk about how to plan an account-based podcasting strategy. How do you collaborate with the stakeholders internally, most notably sales, to pull off this strategy very effectively? And then also, I'm going to share with you a step-by-step cadence on how to do this program. Let's begin with a definition of account-based podcasting. Notice the big, bold, in orange word intentional. This approach is being intentional about publishing podcast content that features your prospects, the people at the companies that you want to do business with, by interviewing them using the interview method. That's what this approach is all about. So I want to talk first about the role of the podcast show host, because that's a make or break role in this strategy. First and foremost, whatever the topic or theme of your podcast show is, your show host must be authoritative on that topic. You can't just pull in someone who's a good interviewer or a good podcaster without he or she being authoritative, knowledgeable on the topic. So in my case, I host the Modern Marketing Engine podcast. I've been in marketing for decades, so I'm very comfortable having conversations with marketing executives on just about any marketing topic. It's very, very important. Secondly, the podcast show host needs to be committed to the podcast and this account-based podcasting strategy. It can't be something that isn't just is willy-nilly and just half-hearted. You've got to be all in on the strategy. And that kind of flows into the need for your podcast show to be consistent, whether it's once a week, or in our case, we do 3 times a month. I've seen some podcast shows be daily. Whatever your publishing schedule is, it needs to be consistent. And so that's another important element of the podcast show and the show host. And the podcast show host also needs to be competent at interviewing. Remember, you're interviewing your prospects. So they've got to be someone who's expert in holding a conversation with your prospects in an interview style, conversational style format that's very effective. So let's unpack that a little bit, starting with the benefits of account-based podcasting. One of the obvious benefits is that it can help you make contact with people who are really hard to reach, especially in an account-based strategy where you're kind of going cold after a logo and they may not even know who you are. So you're doing outbound marketing to them and outbound selling to them. And this approach can help you reach those hard to reach executives in those target accounts. Secondly, it can also help you build relationships with those senior executives that you want to interview on your podcast show. And you are literally creating conversations, because that's what we're doing on the podcast is we're having conversations with the guest, the person that you're interviewing. And those conversations can lead to more conversations, which can lead to opportunities, which is the whole name of the game. So I want to talk next about how do you collaborate internally with your stakeholders? And your biggest stakeholders are in sales. First and foremost, I know it sounds obvious, but identify the target accounts. And that should be a collaborative effort between both marketing and sales. Lots of ways to do that. I'll leave that up to you. But first and foremost, identify the target accounts, and then also identify the target roles within those accounts that are going to be the ones that you are interviewing. And then determine how are you going to invite them to come on to your show and be interviewed? What is your outreach strategy? So I want to review with you an outreach strategy that I've been using for a couple of years, and it's very effective. It's also very simple. So I've got a template. In fact, I've got more than a dozen templates that I use for both outreach and ongoing communication with podcast guests. Because it turns out that once you start the communication, there's a lot of communication that has to happen back and forth with your guests. And so I've set up templates for them. So here's what that template looks like, but I'm going to walk you through how I use that template. And so here we go. My template simply reads, on the Modern Marketing Engine podcast, we showcase marketing leaders at B2B companies on marketing practices in a thought leadership format, and we want to showcase you. And then I have a call to action. Visit our podcast page to learn more about the podcast. So simple, straightforward, and it's also brief, right? Brevity is important when you're emailing an executive, especially a cold email. So that is the most effective email template that I have. Again, it's more than a dozen templates that I have in doing my outreach and ongoing communication with people on my podcast. So to that end, I use a tool that I'm going to encourage you to use as well, and it's called Fly Message. It's from Vengresso. It's a Chrome extension. It's a free Chrome extension. I think all Chrome extensions are free. And I've got all my templates set up there. So every time I go to use it, all I do is type in a little short code. We call it a fly cut. And then boom, that message is populated. And all I do is put in the person's first name and away you go. So I encourage you to install the Fly Message Chrome extension as well. It's available at flymessage.io. And then here it is at the website. And hey, you can thank me later. I want to give you an example of what it's like to be on the receiving end of a creative outreach message. And here's when I was invited to be on a podcast with LinkedIn, and they used this Sunday matinee theme. Pretty cool. LinkedIn's Making Growth Happen Part 6, starring Bernie Borges, right? Very creative. And hey, we're marketers. You can think of your own creative ways to do your outreach and then set those up in your Fly Message template library so that you can just pick and choose the different creative messages that you have and then see which ones work best for you. Now, when you're doing your outreach, it is important to have social proof, meaning especially if you're doing cold outreach, which in many cases, you're going to be doing cold outreach to executives to invite them on your podcast. So it's important to have social proof and to demonstrate that your show is legit and that they're going to have a good experience and they have a reason that they should be motivated to accept your invitation. So here's an example of a visual that I've shared that shows, in this case, 9 examples, 9 marketing executives that have been on my podcast, the theme or the topic that we covered on each episode. And so I want to show this to you, but also I want you to know that if you are just getting started and you don't have this social proof, then the way to create that social proof is simply to invite some of your key customers onto the first 10 to 15 episodes. Interview and showcase those customers and tell their story, give them the stage, showcase their thought leadership on a topic that truly demonstrates their domain expertise on your show, on your podcast, and then create your version of this visual here. And that's the way of you demonstrating your social proof. This way, when you're doing your cold outreach, you've got that social proof. Now I want to talk about planning the podcast recording. You've done the outreach. They've accepted your invitation. How do you plan that podcast recording so it's a great experience for your guest and it's a great experience for you and your show so that you can generate opportunities from it, leads from it? First of all, you want to start that first conversation as the planning conversation. This is where you're planning the podcast content with your guests. So you set up first a planning call, not the podcast recording call, but a planning call. And here you're focused on building the outline of the podcast conversation. And you really want to demonstrate that you are really committed, you are dedicated to showcasing your guests' thought leadership, their expertise on that episode. And you're building the outline together. I do it literally in a Word document. I've got a templated Word document, and I simply build the outline on screen with my guest while we're talking and they see me typing and they see the outline coming together. It's a 30-minute call. And at the end of that 30-minute call, we have an outline for the podcast recording. And the guest appreciates it because we've done the planning and I've done all the heavy lifting. All I did was ask a few questions, listen to them, and then built the outline. Now, make sure that you are crystal clear to your guest on the editorial mission of your podcast. Make sure they understand what your goal is. You know by now that the goal, the editorial mission of my podcast, the Modern Marketing Engine podcast, is to showcase B2B marketing practitioners on their modern marketing journey. Make sure you always demonstrate, continually reinforce your commitment to showcasing their thought leadership on whatever topic you're covering. And then make sure you show previous examples of guests that you've interviewed on your show. As I mentioned, that's social proof and helps you really, win them over in that initial relationship building stage. Now, the next step is you now have a deliverable. Now that you have built the show outline, you've got that as a deliverable to deliver to your guest. Make sure that they're bought into that outline because that is mission critical. You're going to be using that outline on the day of the recording for the two of you to be looking at together blindly because it's a podcast. It's usually audio only. And that's the format. That's the basis of your interview. Make sure also that your guest has a good microphone. Now, they don't have to have a microphone like the one that I'm using here. They can have a USB headset. They can have a simple $30, $40 USB microphone that's available on Amazon. But audio quality is very, very important in a podcast. So ask your guest to use a microphone. Just make sure they're not talking into the open microphone on a speaker because that audio quality is poor and it has an impact on the quality of the episode. And then also ask your guest to listen to at least one of your previous episodes. This does two things. Number one, it helps them become familiar with the show, the format, your interview style. And it also, the second thing it does is that it helps them see what a peer of theirs experienced on your show. And it gives them confidence that they're going to be in for a good experience as well. It really builds credibility with you and your guest. So they come to that recording, that podcast recording, with a sense of confidence in what they're going to experience with you. Now, let's talk about preparing for the sales conversation, because again, this whole strategy, this account-based podcasting strategy is all about lead generation, right? Now, it is about creating a great podcast recording, demonstrating the thought leadership of your guests, but ultimately, we also want to try to maximize the lead generation potential. So first, collaborate with sales and make sure that they help you prepare by doing the due diligence on that account and that they understand to the extent that it's possible what the situation is on that at that account. Make sure that sales has documented their pain. Don't rely on just a phone conversation. Don't rely on you remembering it. Have it written down, have it in front of you so that you know what their pain is. Now, sometimes it's explicit, sometimes it's implied, meaning it might be just a common pain that many companies are experiencing. Whatever the case may be, you run with that, but make sure you've got it known and documented. And that's the main point there is that it's in front of you, it's documented, and so that when you're ready to discuss it, you're not trying to remember it. You've got it in front of you in written format. Now, on the day of the recording, this is the day you're recording the podcast with an executive at a target account. So start out with a little bit of friendly chat, review the outline, just make sure they're comfortable. I like to go through the flow of the outline point by point. I tell them it's not a script, but it is an outline for talking points. Just want to make sure that nothing's changed because maybe we built that outline a couple of weeks ago, and just get a refresher with your guest on that outline. Also, ask them for 5 minutes of additional time after the recording. I will tell you that when I book a podcast recording, I book it for 1 hour. And I always tell them that, we're generally going to get done between 40 and 45 or 50 minutes. So I'm probably going to give you 10 minutes back, but I need you to book an hour just so we have enough time for before the recording and a little bit of time after the recording. Need to make sure that the recording files download properly. And that's absolutely a true statement. You want to make sure those recording files download properly, because if they don't, you're going to have to re-record. And that's happened once in my almost 300 episodes, but it can happen. Then, of course, go ahead and record your fabulous interview with your guest. You're ready. You are ready now. Record that podcast with your guest. And then after you're done, that's when you transition to their business. Now, there's a chance that you might have learned a little bit more about their business during the podcast recording, which is awesome. That might feed into the conversation that you want to have. And this is where you want to reveal the pain that you know to the guest. So simply transition to a conversation about their business and ask, hey, can I reveal to you something that I've learned about your company? Or if you want to say that maybe someone in your company or sales team has called attention to this, and then ask permission to present that. All right. Now, I've never had anyone say no to present it, but now once you've presented it, now you've got two potential responses. All right. And I want to review those with you as your call to action. In one scenario, the guest may say, I acknowledge that. Yes, we have that pain. And when you ask, is there someone there, if it's not you, that we can talk to about how we can help you address that pain? So in our case at Vengresso, a common pain that we're going to bring up is, a very small percentage, and we'll use the number 15, 17, 18% of your sales team have engaged on LinkedIn in the last 30 days. That's public information that we can get from Sales Navigator. And so if such a low percentage of your sales team are engaging on LinkedIn, it's a pretty good chance that they don't have a good pipeline. Is your sales team experiencing an inadequate pipeline? So if the guest says yes and yes, now it's okay, we can help with that. So who in your company is the right person for us to have a conversation with? So scenario number one is your guest acknowledges it. But scenario number two is your guest doesn't acknowledge it. They simply decline to admit that that's a real pain. And it may be legitimate. Maybe they don't have that pain, or maybe they're just not willing to transition to that as a next step. In either case, speaking from personal experience, on average, about half the time we experience scenario one, where the guest acknowledges it and is willing to engage us in a conversation. And then the other half, the guest either isn't willing or doesn't acknowledge the pain. Now, it's not all is lost, though, if the guest is scenario two, because what's happened more often than not is somewhere down the road, either the guest or somehow through our social surrounding and our digital selling efforts, we actually were able to revisit the conversation. And in many cases, the guest was willing to make an introduction because they did acknowledge the pain after this conversation that we're having right here and now. So don't fret if someone declines during the podcast, at the end of the podcast recording, because oftentimes it can happen down the road. Now, I want to continue to hammer home this point here, because you have now just transitioned to essentially a potential sales conversation. But do not ever let your guest think that your editorial theme is no longer important or no longer the dominant, prevalent reason that you came together. The editorial theme is all about you delivering on your promise to showcase your guests' thought leadership. That's what your editorial theme is all about. Let them know how you're going to promote the podcast, because that's important to them. They want to make sure that the podcast is going to be promoted. Talk to them about how you're going to engage in social surrounding, meaning you're going to tag them and other people within their company. And then also the fact that this content is going to be treated as evergreen content. When we promote a podcast episode, we are often promoting it for about a year, unless there's a time restriction on it, like an event or something like that has happened already. But that's the exception. It's not the norm. We're usually promoting a podcast episode for about 1 year. So let them know that it's going to be promoted as evergreen content. And then also during this conversation, ask for a referral because they may know someone at a target account. And even if it's not a target account, it still might be someone worth interviewing and still someone might be someone worth having on your podcast for your ABP lead generation strategy. And sometimes your guest can be a great source of referrals to future guests on your podcast. Now, also share with your guests how you're going to promote the podcast. Let them know that you're going to be active on social. Let them know that you're going to create great visuals. As you see here, we've got a picture of the guest. We've got the title of the episode. We've got an example of what a LinkedIn post looks like. So let them know, like give them a visual, give them a real clear understanding of how you're going to promote the podcast. That gets them even more bought into the excitement of being a guest on your show, and also collaborating internally within their team on promoting the podcast once it's published. So let's look at some of the results that you can get from account-based podcasting. Number one, it can absolutely open doors into some of those hard to reach accounts by establishing relationships and contacts with people who are hard to reach. And as I just mentioned, it can absolutely help you build relationships. Remember, you're going to have two conversations. You're going to have a planning conversation, which is about a 30-minute conversation where you're doing the heavy lift and you're demonstrating your commitment to the quality of the episode, as well as your commitment to showcasing their thought leadership. And then you're going to have the podcast recording, which is about an hour or so of the two of you together. So you can build some relationships that you can actually build on. And as I mentioned earlier, you can also get referrals to other podcast guests that might be a part of your account-based podcasting strategy as well. And ultimately, it can help you build pipeline. I can tell you from experience, not only have we built pipeline from this account-based podcasting strategy, from the guests that we've interviewed on our podcast, but we've also, some of those opportunities have actually closed and have become customers. So this approach is effective so long as you are building relationships and you are absolutely demonstrating their thought leadership and then bridging to a conversation that can help you build those opportunities. I want to start to close here with a couple of examples of account-based podcasting strategies. So my friend Ian Barkin is CMO at Sykes. They're a BPO, a business process outsourcing company, global company. They have a show called One Take, and Ian, similarly, he's interviewing influencers and customers and prospects on his show, One Take, and builds great relationships from that. And then likewise, in addition to my podcast, the Modern Marketing Engine podcast, we also have at Vengresso another podcast, and that is the Modern Selling Podcast. It's hosted by our CEO, Mario Martinez Jr., and Mario interviews and showcases thought leaders like industry analysts, heads of sales, CROs, so practitioners, heads of sales enablement, and likewise is building great relationships with those executives and then starting conversations, many of which turn into opportunities for us. So I just want to leave you with a reminder: install FlyMessage, that free Chrome extension, to help you really have high productivity on all the messages that you're going to be sending out. Again, you can thank me later. And hey, on that note, I want to invite you to connect with me. Check out our podcast, my podcast, the Modern Marketing Engine Podcast. You can see the link there, vengresso.com/Modern Marketing Engine Podcast. I invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn. And if you have any questions on this strategy, account-based podcasting, I invite you to email me. You can see my email on screen. So I hope this has been useful for you. And hey, I look forward to connecting and hearing about your account-based podcasting success. Until next time, see ya.